There is a problem at the foundation of Mormonism that the LDS Church has never been able to solve. How did a 24-year-old man with minimal formal education and a criminal record for treasure digging produce a nearly 600-page book filled with sophisticated sermons and theological debates that were playing out across the most educated pulpits in America? The official explanation is divine revelation. But the data, stylometry, historical timelines, and linguistic analysis points in a far more human direction, and a far more calculated one. His name was Sidney Rigdon. And the moment you understand who he was and what he had been preaching for years before he ever met Joseph Smith, you will never read the Book of Mormon the same way again. This is not just about the authorship of a book. This is about who actually designed the priesthood structure, the economic system, and the organizational blueprint of one of the wealthiest institutions on the planet, and why that person was systematically erased from the official record. Stay with me, because in Part 3, I am going to show you a single document from 1833, and the exact words that were changed when it was republished 2 years later. When you see what was altered, the entire founding narrative falls apart. What I'm going to show you is the physical evidence of a political maneuver that continues to this day. Part 1. The Intellectual Profile. To understand why Sidney Rigdon matters, you first need to understand who he was before Joseph Smith ever entered the picture. And more importantly, you need to understand why a man of his caliber would eventually need someone like Smith. By the late 1820s, Rigdon was already one of the most prominent preachers in the Western Reserve of Ohio, a frontier region that had become the epicenter of religious experimentation in early America, a place where new denominations were being invented almost monthly. He was not some rural minister stumbling through Sunday sermons. He was a trained theologian, a gifted orator, and a recognized leader within one of the most intellectually rigorous religious movements of his time, the Restoration movement founded by Alexander Campbell. Campbell's movement was built on a radical premise that mainstream Christianity had drifted so far from the original church described in the New Testament that it needed to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Not reformed, not revised, restored. That single word, restoration, would become the foundational concept of Mormonism. And Sidney Rigdon had been preaching it for years before Joseph Smith claimed his first vision. But restoration was not the only idea Rigdon carried with him. He was deeply immersed in millennialism, the conviction that the second coming of Christ was imminent and that believers needed to prepare by building a purified community. He preached about gathering the faithful into a single geographic location. He preached about communal economics, where members would consecrate their property to the church. He preached about a literal Zion, a holy city that the righteous would construct in preparation for Christ's return. Now pause and consider that list. Restoration of the primitive church, millennialism, gathering, consecration of property, the building of Zion. If you are even casually familiar with early Mormon doctrine, you just heard the entire theological foundation of the Latter-day Saint movement, articulated by Sidney Rigdon years before 1830. This is not speculation. These themes are documented in Rigdon's sermons and in the records of his congregations throughout the 1820s. Alexander Campbell himself publicly accused Rigdon of stealing his ideas and transplanting them into Mormonism. Campbell wrote about it. He named Rigdon directly. And the early Mormon leadership never produced a convincing rebuttal. Then there is the geography. Rigdon was operating in northeastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, uncomfortably close to the environment where the Book of Mormon was being produced. The official church timeline claims that Rigdon first encountered the Book of Mormon in late 1830, after it was already published. But multiple witnesses from the period told a very different story. They placed Rigdon in contact with Smith's inner circle much earlier. Parley P. Pratt, who supposedly introduced Rigdon to the Book of Mormon, had been attending Rigdon's congregation before he ever became a Mormon. The connection ran in the opposite direction from the one the church describes. But here is the piece that makes the story human, rather than conspiratorial. Rigdon had the intellect, but he did not have the temperament. He suffered from bouts of severe depression. He was emotionally volatile, prone to erratic behavior and dark moods that made it impossible for him to sustain a following on his own. He lacked the raw charisma and the fearless self-assurance that made people follow Joseph Smith into impossible situations. Rigdon could design a theology, but he could not sell it to farmers and blacksmiths on the frontier. Smith could sell anything to anyone, but he did not have the theological depth to build what Rigdon had spent years constructing in his mind. They were not conspirators, they were a perfect fit. The architect and the showman, the theologian and the prophet. And what happened when they came together was not a coincidence. It was a collaboration that neither man could have achieved alone. Hold that in your mind. Because the speed of what happens next, once Rigdon officially arrives, makes no sense unless you understand that this partnership was already in motion long before anyone admitted it. And at the end of part 1, remember this. The man who designed the machine was also the man whose mind would eventually break. That breakdown is going to cost him everything, and hand Brigham Young an empire. Part 2. The evidence in the text. If Sidney Rigdon contributed to the Book of Mormon, the text itself should carry evidence of that contribution. And this is where modern computational linguistics delivers something the 19th century could not: measurable data. Stylometry is the science of identifying authorship through statistical analysis of writing patterns. Every person writes with unconscious habits: preferred sentence lengths, word frequencies, grammatical constructions, the ratio of common words to rare ones. These patterns function like a literary fingerprint. They are extremely difficult to fake and nearly impossible to sustain across hundreds of pages. In 2008, researchers at Stanford, Matthew Jockers, Daniela Witten, and Craig Criddle published a stylometric study that applied rigorous statistical methods to the Book of Mormon. Their findings were clear. The text is not uniform. It does not read as though a single mind produced it. Instead, it breaks into identifiable layers with distinct authorial signatures: the narrative passages, the wars, the migrations, the political intrigue carry one set of stylistic markers. The theological passages, the sermons, the doctrinal expositions, the extended religious arguments carry a distinctly different set. This was not an opinion piece. It was peer-reviewed computational analysis from one of the most respected universities in the world. Now, the narrative layer has long been connected to the Spalding manuscript theory. Solomon Spalding was a former minister who wrote an unpublished novel about ancient civilizations in the Americas. The church has a standard response to this. They point out that the Spalding manuscript recovered years later does not closely resemble the Book of Mormon, and there are references to a second, more developed manuscript that was never found. But here is what matters most. The debate over where the narrative came from, whether it was Spalding, or folk legends, or Smith's own imagination, is ultimately a distraction. Because a story about ancient Indians is not what made Mormonism. Any number of frontier storytellers could have produced an adventure tale about lost civilizations in America. What made Mormonism was the theology injected into that narrative. The sermons, the doctrinal arguments, the ecclesiastical framework embedded in the text. That is the signature that cannot be faked, and that is the signature that points directly to Sidney Rigdon. The theological passages in the Book of Mormon engage with debates that were highly specific to the Restoration movement in the 1820s. They address baptism by immersion, the authority of the priesthood, the rejection of infant baptism, the nature of the Trinity, and the relationship between faith and works. These were not generic Protestant concerns. They were the exact controversies being fought between Alexander Campbell's followers and mainstream denominations, controversies in which Sidney Rigdon was a central participant. It does not matter who wrote the war chapters. What matters is who wrote the sermons. And the sermons are Rigdon's territory. The linguistic evidence goes further than topic. It goes to dialect. Researchers have identified grammatical constructions and regional vocabulary in the Book of Mormon that are characteristic of the Appalachian dialect spoken in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, Rigdon's home territory. These are forms that would not have been natural to Joseph Smith, who grew up in the burned-over district of western New York, another hotbed of religious revival, but with its own distinct speech patterns. Specific verb constructions, the use of particular conjunctions, and certain archaic phrasings that appear in the Book of Mormon map more closely to the written and spoken patterns of educated speakers from Rigdon's region than to any documented sample of Smith's own language. Smith's personal letters and early dictations show a markedly different voice, less structured, less theologically precise, and less syntactically complex than the sermon passages in the Book of Mormon. The Jockers, Witten, and Criddle study did not prove that Rigdon wrote the Book of Mormon. No single study can do that. But it demonstrated, with statistical rigor and institutional credibility, that the text has multiple authorial layers, and that the theological layer is inconsistent with Joseph Smith as the sole author. For LDS apologists, the problem is not that one researcher made a claim. The problem is that the data keeps pointing in the same direction, no matter who runs the analysis. Part 3. The architect inside the church. Now watch what happens after Rigdon officially joins the church in November 1830. Within weeks, not months, not years, weeks, Sidney Rigdon becomes the second most powerful figure in the entire movement. Joseph Smith immediately designates him as his spokesman, his counselor, and effectively his co-leader. For a man who supposedly just discovered the Book of Mormon through a missionary visit, this is an extraordinary ascent. There is no probationary period. There is no gradual rise through the ranks. Rigdon arrives and is instantly installed at the center of power. This only makes sense if Smith already knew exactly what Rigdon could do, because he had been relying on it for years. And then the real work begins. It is Rigdon who designs the organizational architecture of the early church. The structure of the priesthood, the division into the Aaronic and Melchizedek orders, the hierarchy of offices, the chain of authority from deacons to apostles, bears the unmistakable imprint of Rigdon's theological training. These were concepts he had studied in Campbell's movement and debated in his own congregations. Smith had shown no interest in ecclesiastical structure before Rigdon's arrival. Afterward, the church suddenly acquired a complex, multi-layered institutional framework that appeared almost overnight. Rigdon is also the primary author of the Lectures on Faith, a series of theological treatises that were included in the Doctrine and Covenants and treated as official scripture for over 50 years. The Lectures on Faith are the most intellectually sophisticated theological documents in early Mormonism. They are systematic, philosophically informed, and structurally rigorous. They read nothing like Joseph Smith's revelatory style. They read exactly like the work of a trained Restoration Movement theologian. Remember that, because those lectures are going to disappear from the canon. And the reason they disappear tells you everything. Now, here is the document I promised you. The Book of Commandments, published in 1833, was the first compilation of Joseph Smith's revelations. And in that original text, God himself sets the boundaries of Joseph Smith's authority. Chapter 4, verse 2 reads, "He has a gift to translate the book, and I have commanded him that he shall pretend to no other gift, for I will grant him no other gift." No other gift. Period. God, speaking through revelation, told Joseph Smith, "You are a translator. That is your role. That is your ceiling. Not a governing prophet. Not the supreme doctrinal authority. A translator." 2 years later, Joseph Smith edited The Voice of God. In the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, that same passage was rewritten. "And you have a gift to translate the plates. And this is the first gift that I bestowed upon you. And I have commanded that you should pretend to no other gift until my purpose is fulfilled in this." Until. One word. No other gift became no other gift until. A permanent divine limitation became a temporary pause. That single insertion opened the door for every prophetic claim, every doctrinal expansion, every consolidation of power that followed. This was not revelation. This was contract editing. Someone looked at the original terms, decided they were too restrictive, and rewrote them to serve a larger ambition. And this revision happened precisely during the period when the balance of power between Smith and Rigdon was shifting, when the question of who truly controlled the theology was being settled not by God, but by ink on paper. Rigdon also engineered the economic system. The law of consecration, where members surrendered their property to the church, was built on the communitarian models Rigdon had been advocating since his days with Campbell. The United Order, the Bishop's Storehouse, the entire framework of church-managed economics that would later define Utah's settlement period. These were Rigdon's ideas, implemented through Smith's prophetic authority. The pattern is always the same. Rigdon designs, Smith announces, and the record is written to make it appear as though only one man was involved. Part 4. The Erasure. Joseph Smith was murdered in Carthage jail on June 27, 1844, and what followed was not a peaceful transition of leadership. It was a political war for control of the most valuable religious franchise in America. Sidney Rigdon had every reason to believe he would lead the church. He was the first counselor in the first presidency. He had been Smith's closest theological partner for 14 years. He had more institutional knowledge, more doctrinal expertise, and more organizational experience than any other figure in the movement. He made his case publicly. He argued that the church needed a guardian, someone to preserve Smith's vision and protect the institution until a clear prophetic successor emerged. It was a reasonable, even conservative position. But by 1844, the tool had become defective. Rigdon's mental health had deteriorated severely. In the months before and after Smith's death, he began claiming increasingly bizarre visions, revelations so strange and erratic that even loyal members found them unsettling. His depressive episodes had grown worse. His behavior in public was unpredictable. The same psychological instability that had always prevented him from leading on his own now made it easy for his opponents to dismiss him. Brigham Young saw the opening and drove through it. Young was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and he understood something that Rigdon, in his diminished state, could not grasp. The future of Mormonism would not be determined by theological credentials or institutional seniority. It would be determined by control of the body of the church, the tens of thousands of members who needed to be led somewhere, physically, after the collapse in Nauvoo. Young had the organizational muscle and the iron nerve. Rigdon had the arguments, but no longer had the mind to deliver them. The architect had broken down, and the foreman took over the building. Young won, and the moment he won, a process began that would take decades to complete. The systematic minimization of Sidney Rigdon in Mormon history. The erasure was not incidental, it was structurally necessary. If the church that followed Brigham Young to Utah was going to claim legitimate succession, it needed the founding narrative to be clean and singular. One prophet, one source of revelation, one unbroken chain of authority from God to Joseph Smith, to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Any acknowledgement that Rigdon had been the intellectual engine of the movement would shatter that chain. So Rigdon was recast. In official histories produced under Young's direction, Rigdon went from co-architect to minor character. His contributions to doctrine were attributed to Smith. His organizational innovations were folded into the general category of prophetic revelation. His theological writings were quietly removed from the canon. And this is where the story of the Lectures on Faith reaches its conclusion. Those treatises, the most intellectually rigorous theological documents in early Mormonism, the ones that bore Rigdon's unmistakable style, were deleted from the Doctrine and Covenants in 1921, not refuted, not replaced with better theology. Simply removed, without formal explanation to the membership. A text that was treated as binding scripture for nearly 90 years was erased. And the most plausible explanation is that its content, its systematic, Protestant-influenced, Rigdon-shaped theology, no longer fit the narrative the church needed to maintain about a single, divinely guided founder. Here is what the evidence, taken together, actually tells us. Sidney Rigdon possessed every intellectual tool necessary to construct the theology of Mormonism. He was preaching its core doctrines before the Book of Mormon existed. The text itself carries linguistic and stylistic markers consistent with his regional dialect and theological training, markers identified by researchers at Stanford using peer-reviewed computational methods. His ascent within the church was instant and inexplicable unless prior involvement is assumed. The organizational, economic, and doctrinal structures of early Mormonism mapped directly onto ideas he had been developing for years. The original 1833 document explicitly limited Smith to the role of translator, and that limitation was rewritten by human hands to serve a human ambition. And after Rigdon's departure, the institutional church spent decades systematically erasing his contributions to protect a founding narrative that required a single, divinely guided author. Joseph Smith was charismatic, bold, and possessed a remarkable ability to inspire devotion. He was the face and the voice. But face and voice are not the same as architect. They needed each other. Smith could not have built the theology alone. Rigdon could not have built the movement alone. Their partnership was not a conspiracy. It was a symbiosis between a brilliant, unstable theologian and a fearless, charismatic frontman. But only one of them ended up in the paintings, the manuals, and the temples. The other was written out of the story, not because he was unimportant, but precisely because he was too important to acknowledge. Sidney Rigdon died in 1876, poor and nearly forgotten, leading a tiny splinter group in rural Pennsylvania. The brand he designed became a $200 billion empire that today can barely bring itself to say his name. The question is not whether the church is true. The question is, why are they so afraid to give credit to the man who actually drew the blueprint? If this investigation changed how you see Mormon origins, subscribe to this channel. Every week we pull apart the documents, the data, and the institutional decisions that the LDS Church would rather you never examine. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you know someone asking hard questions about their faith, send them this video. The truth does not need protection, it needs an audience.